Hello, my name is Mateusz Boksa, and I'm a sophomore at Schaumburg High School. And today I'll be presenting my economic research a research report, which compared and contrasted the coronavirus recession and recovery to other recessions and recoveries throughout the years. So for to start off, the economy is a representation of what a country, or specifically the resources and the wealth of a country in that specific year, and it's mainly tracked with employment, inflation, and specifically the GDP, which tracks the amount of goods and services a country sells in a sense during that year or across the world. And as right now, we have seen a positive GDP going from year to year. Of course, unless there's a year where a major recession hit or depression. But since the Great Depression, the economy has gone up significantly because of that, and it's shown through the GDP. Obviously, the economy has a lot of turning points, as anything could be going on in the world, causing other products to not be made, like the pandemic showed, where all businesses shut down and a lot of shortages occurred. And lastly, the business cycle, the economy represents the business cycle in which you have expansions, peaks, which are the good things that people want to see, and then of course, recessions, and even depressions, and followed by those, following those are obviously recoveries, which are positive things and hope in those hard times. So the COVID-19 pandemic obviously hit everybody differently. It could have been on an emotional level, personal level, mental level, even specifically a health level. However, the way it impacted the economy was the fact that lots of businesses shut down because of the mandatory lockdowns put in place by the government all across the world, specifically the United States. Because of that, it affected the business cycle as businesses shutting down indicates that a lot of people got fired or lost their jobs during that time, meaning they didn't have the money to spend on products and goods, decreasing the GDP, of course, and obviously shutting down, closing down that business cycle and leaning into a recession. Because of that, vice versa too, with businesses shutting down and lockdowns going occurring in all countries all over the world, businesses weren't allowed to make those specific products, and that was another major reason why the economy went into a recession. So the two major recessions, or in this case, one of them being a depression, that I decided to compare the coronavirus pandemic recession and recovery to were the Great Depression and the Great Recession. And the reason why I chose those were, in my opinion, they were the two biggest ones, at least the two major ones that showed huge decreases in the economy at those times. And also, these two are significantly far apart, and the Great Recession is significantly, at least in the same century as the pandemic, which is interesting to see how those two differentiate and how time definitely changed that, especially because these aren't the only three recessions and recoveries that happened and occurred in American history. So just starting off with these two, both of these were obviously terrible economic times in the United States and around the world. A lot of people lost jobs. A lot of people were affected by it majorly. Jobs were one big thing. GDP obviously went down. A lot of bad things were happening financially and economically. Both of these were actually sparked by the Great Depression was actually spiked by the stock market crash, and the Great Recession was sparked by the housing market crash because of the housing market bubble that was built up due to banks selling or giving out subprime mortgages with high interest rates to try to make more money. With that being said, it's clear that those two things sparked them, and there's this common trend of things leading up to a recession, and then obviously after that would be a recovery. Through these recessions and recoveries, the government was obviously taught how to deal with them through different measures. This was either through fiscal policies or monetary policies done by the Federal Reserve. And with this being said, the Great Depression actually didn't have many fiscal or monetary policies, especially before President Roosevelt came into office. However, the Great Recession, or also known as the 2008 financial crisis, showed a lot more policies being played, such as that QE, or quantitative easing, which stimulated the economy, putting it back on track. Um, Sorry about that. So some of the similarities, obviously, between all three was the unemployment rate went down and significantly, especially during the Great Depression, where almost 25% of people, 24.9% of people lost their jobs, which is 1 in 4 Americans, an absolutely dramatic number and dramatic decrease, all which occurred because of the stock markets crashing, which previously was made as businesses overestimated their success rate or production rate and overproduced too many goods. The GDP obviously went down in all three pandemics, recessions. As obviously in the Great Depression, businesses shut down, laid off a lot of workers because they were overproducing the product. And then later on, of course, people lost jobs, meaning they couldn't purchase anything, meaning those products didn't need to be made. But of course, that affected the economy negatively. Same with the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of people lost their job, 10% of the employment rate reached the levels of 10% in October of 2009. And obviously, with more people not being employed, not as many people are making money, and that led to not many people needing as many products, specifically wants in this case. And then obviously the coronavirus pandemic recession, which showed us a major decrease in unemployment in a very, very short amount of time. And numbers like this, especially with GDP dropping, were compared to the Great Depression, which was a very scary time to see, especially during this economic period. Eventually, obviously, we came into a recovery, and now this economy is slowly starting to build back up. And inflation also occurred during the recovery process, which meant since, especially currently, with so much money being pumped into the market, the inflation is obviously there, and it has been seen. And not only is the inflation currently seen from the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, but it's also seen from previous recessions where the inflation levels weren't as high after the recession. So the difference is, of course, the coronavirus recession actually increased the housing market, which was a huge shocker. And all this occurred because people were forced to stay home, meaning a lot of them, just to say shortly, got sick of their homes and decided to find like new places to live. And with the decreased rates by the Federal Reserve of interest rates, people just were more motivated to buy houses, found different locations, especially since they didn't need to be at their work, and decided to move further away into more rural areas with less people. And this recession obviously started because of a worldwide lockdown, which was caused by a virus, which is really different from the other two, as this one was more of a biological factor rather than the other two being a financial factor. The Great Recession, the housing market actually decreased, like was also seen during the Great Depression, which a lot of people were evicted. But this was all occurred because of the housing bubble bursting, which occurred as previously to this recession. A lot of people were wanting to buy houses, and with the banks getting greedy, they decided to hand out subprime mortgages to people who did not have the best of credit scores, and they won on that as the interest rates were significantly high, and people who weren't sure at least that they were going to be able to pay back those mortgages knew that they could rely on the housing market, which was super stable at that time and constantly moving forward and booming at that point. Obviously, at that point, the people realized that houses weren't as profitable, and the demand for houses decreased and burst the bubble, with people not being able to pay their subprime mortgages and banks losing a ton of money, which affected everybody who had money in the banks. And the Great Depression, which started because of the stock market crash, a little different from the previous two. And however, because of that, this was one of the first major great depressions in this case, or recessions in American history or across the world. And the government and Federal Reserve weren't used to the depressions or economic recessions lasting this long. Therefore, this was a huge and hard time for everybody during that time period, especially with many people being evicted. And a common phrase that was picked up was these Hoovervilles. As a lot of people got evicted, they decided to move outside the cities and build their own homes, or from at least they had. During the recovery, obviously there's a significant pattern since the Great Depression, especially where the government and the Federal Reserve were able to deal with these recessions much better than they did in previous ones. Especially this one, the coronavirus pandemic recession, which showed dramatic decreases in the economy, and yet the government and Federal Reserve were able to do the right things in order to put us back on track. With this being said, there's hope for the future that although the economy is constantly going to be moving up or down, the hope is that eventually the Federal Reserve and government will get it down to a point where they could limit those. 2020 was obviously a very unexpected year, and nobody expected it going the way it did. However, personally, I think the government and Federal Reserve did a great job of putting and making the economy go back on track. Um, and lastly, of course, thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great day.